Welcome to the Vermont School Boards Association Online Academy. My name is Winton Goodrich. I'm the Associate Director here at the SBA. And today's presentation will focus on School Board Code of Conduct. The materials are available for you to follow along. And the first component of the materials is dealing with confidentiality. Before I get into the different bulleted components, I just want to say that school board members certainly are entitled by constitutional rights to make up their own mind. However, you're working as a member of a team here, and by establishing standards for how the board members are going to interact with each other and what's acceptable as a team and what isn't is really what the Code of Conduct is all about. So dealing with confidentiality, there's nothing in state law that requires board members to maintain personal information about a staff member or about a student. However, it's the potential litigation that could ensue. To alleviate any concern you might have about that, state law does require all school districts to carry what's called errors and omissions insurance policy that will protect school board members, administrators, and teachers from any lawsuits that might concentrate on their personal assets. However, the contract language does say that employees or school board members should follow policies they knew about or should have known about in order for that policy to be enforced. And the more times that you use this policy, the higher the premiums are going to go. It's very much like collision on your car insurance. The more accidents you have, the higher the cost of the annual premium. So confidentiality for litigation purpose and just to maintain public trust and the trust of your fellow members of the leadership team are critically important. Board members should not assume any individual authority. The only authority that a board has is when it's a warned board meeting and it's the board itself, it's not any individuals. Only if the board authorizes, for example, the board chair to do something of particular interest to the board does an individual board member have any right to carry the weight of the board or the authority of the board. The board should focus on improving student achievement. You do that by inviting teachers and students to do periodic presentations at board meetings and have policies that give directive to administrators to get that job done. You refer complaints through a chain of command, and that's another online workshop, so I'm not going to spend time in this presentation on that topic. That board members should treat each other, the administrators, and members of the public with respect at all times. You model the expected behavior in your school district, and that you ought to be setting a very good example. Consider the needs of students and at the same time the needs of community. 20% of your voters in your town or your district generally have students in schools, 80% do not. And so you in the board role are bridging that balance between the community needs and affordability and what the needs of students are for the future, not just for the current or time period or the past, but in the future. Conflict of interest is a component in Code of Conduct. It's a state law, and if you violate the conflict of interest statute, it's a $1,000 fine and it's loss of the ability to serve on a school board for 2 years. However, there are some ways for dealing with this. You don't have to give up gainful employment. For example, if you are a snowplow operator and you'd like to bid on plowing the schoolyard as a school board member, you could do that. It's not advisable politically, but legally, to be able to be considered for this contract, it would have to be put out to bid, you as a school board member would have to recuse yourself from the vote, which means you don't vote, and you ought to remove yourself from board deliberation, which means leave the board room when this issue is being discussed. And finally, to reflect in the board minutes that those actions took place, that you didn't vote and that you didn't influence your fellow board members by being in the room. You also can't gain anything financially, personally, or politically from your board service. The final component of Code of Conduct is that board members agree to participate in board professional development. And that may mean within your district, or it may be in regional meetings or state conferences that are put on by the Vermont School Boards Association or other educational groups. As far as a consequence or series of consequences, if a board member fails to follow the school board code of conduct that's agreed to by the board and signed by all the board members, hopefully, then here's your recourse. The first time that a given board member violates the expectations that are laid out in the code, the superintendent and the board chair ought to sit down with that board member and just have a conversation. Maybe he or she didn't really understand, or it's a first level of mild accountability. If they have to deal with their egregious behavior, that might be uncomfortable for them. At the second level, you could go into an executive session under Title I, Section 313, subsection 4, where it's the evaluation of a public officer. In this context, that public officer is the school board member. And so in so many words, you take that board member to the woodshed in closed session and find out what it was that they were thinking about when they put the board in a very difficult liability, litigation, or potentially loss of public trust situation. Third level is to do the same thing in open session, and that's called, under Robert's Rules of Parliamentary Procedure, that's called a censure, C-E-N-S-U-R-E, and that's a public reprimand. In other words, taking them to the woodshed in open session. And that's very uncomfortable. And it doesn't mean that the board wouldn't get sued for doing that. It's happened, and there's some case law in Vermont where that did take place. The fourth level of progressive consequence for violating the Code of Conduct would be that the board takes a stand in open session that the actions of said board member are not supported by the board. And what that does is that isolates that person's behavior as their own and not a representative of the full school board. And the last level of recourse or consequence is that the board in open session might ask that board member to resign, but there's no way that the board could enforce that. In other words, it's political pressure, it's not legal positioning. So as we wrap up today in the Code of Conduct presentation, it identifies a number of components that board members ought to agree to. And once they agree to uphold those, that the board ought to sign this document, and we even encourage the board to post that in the front entrance of the school so that everyone in the community knows that the board is being accountable to itself. And if there are a board member or two that refuse to sign it, let them explain away why they weren't willing to uphold these reasonable standards. So with that, thank you for tuning in. This is the School Board Code of Conduct.